After the last mourner left, I stayed quiet about the second house across town. A week later, my daughter-in-law said, "One day without you here will be the best day of my life." I smiled. They'd never see it. They weren't my choice, but let me start from the beginning, because that moment didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of something that had been building since the day we buried Harold. The funeral home smelled of lilies and artificial air freshener, a combination that made my stomach turn. I'd been there since 6 in the morning, arranging Harold's viewing exactly how he would have wanted it. His navy uniform pressed and perfect, the American flag folded just right beside the casket, and his favorite fishing photo displayed on the easel nearby. I was adjusting the flowers for the third time when Diane walked in, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown timer.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel.
She wore a
We'd
black
love to see
dress
how
that
far our
probably
stories
cost
are
more than
reaching.
my monthly grocery budget, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. "Margaret, we need to talk about the arrangements," she said without so much as a good morning. "Robert and I think we should move the receiving line to the other side of the room. It flows better with the family seating." I looked up from the gladiolas Harold had always loved. "I've already spoken with the funeral director. Everything is set exactly as Harold requested." Diane's perfectly painted lips tightened. "Well, Harold isn't here to see it, is he? The living family members should have some say in how this is handled." The cruelty of her words hit me like cold water. Harold had been dead for 3 days, and she was already erasing his wishes. I opened my mouth to respond, but Robert appeared beside her, looking uncomfortable in his dark suit. "Mom, Diane has some good ideas about the flow of people," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe we could just consider moving a few things around?" This was my son, the boy I'd raised alone for 10 years while Harold served overseas, the child I'd driven to every baseball game, every school play, every friend's birthday party, and he was siding with his wife over his father's final arrangements. "The flowers stay where they are," I said quietly. "The receiving line stays where it is. This is what your father wanted." Diane exchanged a look with Robert that I pretended not to see. It was the same look they'd been sharing for months whenever I expressed an opinion about anything, the look that said I was becoming a problem to be managed. The morning continued with a series of small battles. Diane questioned my choice of music, suggested I was greeting people too emotionally, and even criticized the way I'd arranged the memory cards on the side table. Each criticism felt like a tiny knife, cutting away at my role as Harold's wife, as the woman who'd known him best. "Margaret, you might want to touch up your makeup," Diane whispered as people began arriving for the service. "You look a bit worn." I caught my reflection in the funeral home's ornate mirror. At 62, I did look worn. The stress of Harold's illness, the sleepless nights at the hospital, and now the weight of planning his funeral had taken their toll. My gray hair was neat, but not styled like Diane's salon-perfect blonde. My black dress was appropriate, but came from a department store, not a boutique. The service itself passed in a blur of condolences and shared memories. Harold's colleagues from the post office spoke about his dedication. Our neighbors remembered his kindness. The pastor talked about his faith and service to country. Through it all, I felt Diane's eyes on me, watching, evaluating, waiting for me to embarrass her somehow. After the burial, everyone gathered back at the house for lunch. Harold and I had lived there for 38 years, raising Robert, building memories in every room. I'd spent the previous evening preparing food, wanting to honor the tradition of sharing a meal in Harold's memory. But as I watched Diane move through my kitchen like she owned it, directing people to help themselves, I felt like a guest in my own home. She'd rearranged the serving dishes I'd carefully laid out, moved the coffee pot to what she called a more logical location, and took over greeting people as if she were the hostess. "The house has such good bones," I heard her telling one of Harold's cousins. "With some updating, it could really be something special." Margaret's always been so focused on keeping everything exactly the same, but sometimes change is necessary to move forward. I was carrying a tray of sandwiches from the kitchen when I heard her words. The implication was clear. I was stuck in the past, resistant to progress, a barrier to improvement. The house that Harold and I had lovingly maintained was somehow lacking because it reflected our tastes, our life together. "I think it's perfect the way it is," Harold's cousin replied diplomatically. "It feels like a real home." Diane laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Well, that's very sweet. But after 38 years, I think it's time for some fresh perspectives, don't you think?" Fresh perspectives, as if everything Harold and I had built together was stale, outdated, ready to be discarded. The afternoon wore on with similar moments, Diane commenting on my dated furniture to anyone who would listen. Robert nodding along when she suggested the house was too much for one person to maintain. The two of them speaking about me in the third person, even when I was standing right there. By evening, after the last guest had left and the dishes were washed, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. I sat in Harold's recliner, something I'd never done while he was alive, and tried to process what had happened. That's when Diane approached me, her helpful mask finally slipping. "Margaret, I know today was difficult, but we need to start thinking practically about the future," she said, perching on the edge of our coffee table like a bird of prey. "This house is going to be a lot of work for you to handle alone. Robert and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider some changes." "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. "Well, the house needs updating if you're going to stay here. New windows, a modern kitchen, maybe some fresh paint and flooring. It would be expensive, and honestly, it might be easier to just sell and find you something more manageable." I looked around the living room where Harold and I had watched countless movies, where we'd celebrated every Christmas morning, where he'd proposed to me 40 years ago. "This is my home, Diane. Harold and I built our life here." "I understand the sentimental attachment," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when she thought she was being patient with me. "But sentiment doesn't pay for roof repairs or new furnaces. Robert and I are young and energetic. We could handle the renovations, maybe even expand a bit for the grandchildren we're planning." The grandchildren they were planning, in my house, while what? Disappeared? "I haven't decided anything yet," I said carefully. Diane's smile grew sharper. "Of course not. You're grieving, but Robert and I are here to help you make the right decisions. That's what family is for." After she and Robert left that night, I sat in the dark house, listening to it settle around me. Every creak and sigh was familiar, comforting. This house held 40 years of my marriage, 28 years of raising Robert, countless moments of joy and sorrow and ordinary life. And my daughter-in-law was already planning to take it away from me. I went to Harold's desk in the small room he'd used as an office, thinking I might find some comfort in going through his papers. He'd always been meticulous about organizing our important documents, and I knew I'd need to understand our financial situation now that I was alone. But as I opened the main drawer, I found something unexpected. A sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 2 months before his death, along with several legal documents I didn't recognize. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're dealing with the aftermath alone. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect that Diane will waste no time in trying to convince you to give up our home. This letter is my way of making sure you have choices, even if you don't know about them yet." My hands shook as I continued reading. Harold had been watching Diane too. He'd noticed her comments about the house, her suggestions about my future, the way she spoke about me like I was already an inconvenience to be managed. The documents in the envelope were deeds and financial statements I'd never seen before. Properties and investments Harold had inherited from his father but never mentioned. A small house across town that had been rented out for years. Savings accounts I didn't know existed. A financial safety net he'd quietly maintained in case I ever needed to be independent. "You don't have to use any of this if you don't want to," his letter continued. "But if our son fails to protect you the way I always tried to, if his wife makes you feel unwelcome in your own home, then you have options. You are not dependent on their kindness, Margaret. You never have to be." I sat there until dawn, reading Harold's letter over and over, studying the documents that revealed a man who'd been preparing for this moment long before his illness. He'd known somehow that I would need protection from the very people who should have protected me. The next morning, Diane called before I'd even finished my coffee. "Margaret, Robert, and I have been talking, and we really think you should consider our offer seriously. We could start looking at condos for you this weekend. There's a lovely senior community just 15 minutes away. A senior community where I could be managed by professionals instead of family." "I need time to think," I said. "Of course, but don't think too long. The real estate market is good right now, and we wouldn't want you to miss the right opportunity." After I hung up, I looked at Harold's letter again. At the bottom, in his firm handwriting, were the words that would sustain me through what was coming. "You are stronger than they know, my love. Show them who you really are." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I called the number Harold had written down for his attorney, a man I'd never met but who apparently knew all about the properties I'd just discovered. Diane wanted to plan my future. She thought she understood exactly who I was and what I was capable of. But she was about to learn that Harold had taught me something important about keeping secrets. Some of the most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming. Harold's attorney, Mr. Davidson, had a voice like gravel and the patience of someone who'd seen every family drama imaginable. When I called him that morning, he didn't seem surprised to hear from me. Mrs. Morrison, I've been wondering when you'd contact me, he said. Harold left very specific instructions about when to share certain information with you. I assume recent events have prompted this call. I found myself crying as I told him about Diane's behavior, about the pressure to sell the house, about feeling like a stranger in my own home. Mr. Davidson listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding that told me Harold had prepared him for exactly this conversation. Your husband was a very wise man, Mrs. Morrison. He loved his son, but he wasn't blind to certain personality traits that might emerge under pressure. Would you like to meet today to discuss your options? 2 hours later, I sat in Mr. Davidson's modest office, learning about a life I'd lived alongside Harold, but never fully understood. The small rental house across town generated $1,200 a month in income. The investment accounts Harold had inherited from his father had grown steadily over the years. There was even a life insurance policy I'd forgotten about, one that wouldn't pay out for another month. Your husband was very careful to keep these assets separate from your joint holdings, Mr. Davidson explained. He wanted to make sure you'd always have independence if you needed it. He also left specific instructions about the timing of this information. What kind of instructions? Mr. Davidson consulted his notes. He asked me to wait until you contacted me first. He didn't want to burden you with financial complexities during your grief unless it became necessary. He hoped, quite frankly, that it wouldn't be, but it had become necessary, sooner than even Harold might have expected. I drove home feeling like I was carrying a secret that changed everything but couldn't change anything yet. I needed time to process what I'd learned, to understand my options before Diane and Robert pressured me into decisions I might regret. That evening, as if she had radar for my emotional state, Diane showed up with takeout Chinese food and a stack of real estate brochures. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," she said, sweeping into my kitchen and beginning to unpack containers. "And I picked up some information about properties that might interest you." She spread the brochures across my dining room table like she was dealing cards. Bright, cheerful photos of senior living communities with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Village, places where activities were scheduled and meals were provided and independence was gently discouraged. "This one has a lovely craft room," Diane said, pointing to a photo of elderly people hunched over a puzzle. "And they have transportation to the grocery store twice a week." Twice a week, as if I couldn't drive myself to buy food whenever I wanted. "I appreciate you thinking of me," I said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any major decisions yet." Diane's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. "Margaret, I understand that change is scary, but sometimes we have to face reality. This house is going to be expensive to maintain, and you'll be living on a fixed income now." Fixed income. She said it like it was a disability, a limitation that would define the rest of my life. "Harold left me well provided for," I said. "I'm sure he tried to, but be realistic. The mortgage payments alone must be significant, and then there's insurance, utilities, maintenance. Wouldn't it be better to sell while the market is good and use that money to secure your future?" What she wasn't saying, but I heard clearly, was that the equity in this house could fund their renovations on a new property. My home's value would become the foundation of their next life stage. Robert appeared from the kitchen with plates and napkins, looking uncomfortable with the conversation but unwilling to stop it. "Mom, we just want you to be safe and comfortable," he said. "This house has a lot of stairs, a big yard to maintain. What if something happens and you're here alone? What if something happens?" The phrase that had terrified me since Harold's diagnosis, the fear that had kept me awake during his final weeks. But now, sitting at my own dining table while my son and daughter-in-law planned my future, I realized there were worse things than being alone. Being surrounded by people who saw you as a burden was one of them. "I'll think about everything you've shown me," I said finally. Diane gathered up the brochures with the efficiency of someone closing a successful sales presentation. "Don't think too long, Margaret. Some of these places have waiting lists." After they left, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to imagine myself in one of those cheerful communities, participating in scheduled activities, eating communal meals, slowly surrendering the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain during Harold's illness. The next few weeks settled into a pattern that felt like water slowly wearing away stone. Diane would find reasons to stop by almost daily, each visit accompanied by subtle pressure about my future. She'd comment on how quiet the house must be for me, how difficult it must be to maintain such a large space, how much easier my life would be with fewer responsibilities. She also began what I came to think of as helpful rearranging. First, she moved my coffee maker to what she called a more convenient location. Then she reorganized my spice cabinet to make cooking easier. Small changes that individually seemed meaningless, but collectively sent a clear message. My way of organizing my own space was wrong. "Margaret, you really shouldn't keep your medications on the kitchen counter," she said one afternoon, moving my pill organizer to a cabinet. It's not safe, and it makes the kitchen look cluttered. My pill organizer, which helped me remember to take my blood pressure medication on schedule, was apparently clutter in my own kitchen. The worst was when she began going through Harold's belongings without asking permission. I came home from grocery shopping one day to find her in our bedroom, sorting through his clothes. "I hope you don't mind," she said when she saw my expression. "I thought I'd help you with this difficult task. Robert said you hadn't been able to face it yet." She'd filled 3 garbage bags with shirts, pants, and jackets that still smelled faintly of Harold's cologne. Items I wasn't ready to part with, memories I needed to process at my own pace. "I was planning to do this myself," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, Margaret, I know this is hard, but holding on to things doesn't bring people back. Sometimes we have to help ourselves heal by letting go. As if my grief operated on her timeline, as if my healing could be managed like everything else in my life she'd decided needed improvement. I waited until she left, then pulled Harold's clothes back out of the garbage bags. Some things I would donate eventually, but not today. Not because Diane thought it was time. I hung his favorite cardigan back in the closet, the one he'd worn every evening while reading his newspaper. The familiar ritual of smoothing the sleeves and closing the closet door brought me more peace than any of Diane's helpful suggestions. That night, I called my sister Ruth, who lived 3 states away. Ruth had met Diane exactly twice, but she'd formed strong opinions both times. "She's trying to erase you from your own life," Ruth said bluntly after I described the latest incidents. "Harold would be furious if he could see what she's doing. Robert thinks she's being helpful. Robert is thinking with the wrong head, if you ask me. That woman has him wrapped around her finger, and she's using him to get what she wants." Ruth was right, but hearing it out loud made me ache for the son I'd raised, the boy who used to defend me against neighborhood bullies and school administrators who underestimated his single mother. That boy had grown into a man who watched his wife dismantle his mother's life and called it helpfulness. "What are you going to do?" Ruth asked. "I don't know yet, but I'm not going to let her push me into anything." Good. Harold didn't raise a pushover, even if some people seem to forget that. After we hung up, I went to Harold's desk and reread his letter. "You are stronger than they know, my love." The words felt like a promise I'd made to him, a commitment to honor not just his memory but the woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who'd raised a child alone during military deployments, who'd managed household finances and made difficult decisions, who'd advocated for Harold during his illness when doctors wanted to give up too early. That woman was still here, even if recent events had made me doubt myself. The next morning, Diane arrived with coffee and pastries from an expensive bakery, the kind of gesture that appeared generous but came with strings attached. "I thought we could look at some properties today," she said, settling into my kitchen like she belonged there. "I made appointments to see 3 different senior communities. We could make a day of it." "I'm not ready to look at properties yet." Diane's smile became strained. "Margaret, we've been having this conversation for weeks. At some point, you have to move forward with your life." "I am moving forward, just not at your pace." For the first time since Harold's funeral, Diane's mask slipped completely. "Fine, but don't expect Robert and me to wait forever while you avoid reality. This house is too much for you, whether you want to admit it or not, and frankly, it's becoming a burden on us too, worrying about you rattling around in here all alone. A burden on them." There it was, the truth she'd been dancing around for weeks. My refusal to cooperate with their plans was inconvenient, an obstacle to whatever future they'd designed for themselves. "I didn't ask you to worry about me," I said quietly. "Well, that's what family does, Margaret. Though I'm starting to wonder if you understand what that means." After she left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the expensive pastries I had no appetite for, feeling the weight of her words. Did I understand what family meant? I'd thought family meant love, support, putting each other's needs first when times were hard. But Diane's version of family seemed to involve managing inconvenient people until they stopped being inconvenient. That afternoon, I drove to the small house Harold had left me, the one I'd learned about just weeks before. It was in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes away. A modest 2-bedroom cottage with a small yard and a front porch that caught the afternoon sun. The tenants had moved out the previous month, and it sat empty, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I had a key now thanks to Mr. Davidson, and I let myself in to walk through rooms that belonged to me but felt foreign. The hardwood floors creaked under my feet, and sunlight streamed through windows that needed washing. It smelled like fresh paint and possibilities. Standing in the small living room, I could imagine a different life. A simpler life, maybe, but one where every decision was mine to make. Where I could arrange my medications on any counter I wanted. Where Harold's clothes could hang in the closet until I was ready to let them go. Where concerned family members couldn't rearrange my spice cabinet for my own good. I locked the door and drove home, but something had shifted during that visit. For the first time since Harold's death, I'd seen a future that didn't involve managing other people's expectations of who I should become. That evening, when Robert called to check on me, I heard myself saying something that surprised us both. "I've been thinking about what you and Diane said about the house being too much for me," I began. "You might be right." The relief in his voice was immediate and unmistakable. "Mom, I'm so glad you're being realistic about this. Diane will be thrilled. She's found some really wonderful options for you." "I'm sure she has, but I think I'd like to handle this myself, in my own time." A pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'll make my own decisions about my future. You and Diane have been very helpful, but I need to do this at my own pace." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course, Mom, whatever you think is best." But I could hear it in his voice, the disappointment that I wasn't falling in line with their carefully laid plans. The frustration that I was still insisting on my own agency in my own life. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's chair, feeling stronger than I had in weeks. And I had options they didn't know about, resources they couldn't manage, and time to make decisions without their helpful pressure. Harold had been right to prepare for this moment, and I was beginning to understand that the best way to honor his memory was to use every tool he'd given me to protect the independence he'd always encouraged me to maintain. The invasion of my life had been gradual, but my response didn't have to be. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I found Diane in my kitchen, making a list on my notepad while talking on her phone. "Yes, the granite countertops would be perfect," she was saying, "and we definitely want to open up this wall between the kitchen and dining room. The whole layout is so dated." She looked up when she saw me standing in the doorway, covering the phone with her hand. "Morning, Margaret. Just getting some measurements for the renovations." "What renovations?" I asked, though my stomach was already sinking. Diane finished her call and turned to face me with that bright smile that never reached her eyes. "Robert and I have been thinking, and we've decided to move forward with updating the house. Even if you decide to stay, it needs work, and if you decide to sell, renovations will increase the value significantly. You've decided." I repeated her words slowly, letting their meaning settle. "In my house. Well, technically, it's going to be our house soon, isn't it? I mean, you can't manage this place forever, and we're the ones who'll inherit it eventually. It makes sense to start planning now." The casual way she said it took my breath away. Technically, it's going to be our house soon. As if my death or removal was simply a matter of logistics to be planned around. "I haven't decided anything about this house," I said. Diane's expression grew impatient. "Margaret, be realistic. You're 62 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, with a yard you can't maintain and repairs you can't afford. Robert and I are young, we have energy, and we understand what needs to be done to bring this place into the modern era. This place," she called it. Not my home, not the house where Harold and I had built our life together. Just this place that needed to be brought into compliance with her vision of how people should live. "The contractors are coming Thursday for estimates," she continued, making notes on her list. "We're looking at new windows throughout, definitely a kitchen remodel, and probably refinishing all the hardwood floors. Oh, and we'll need to do something about that outdated wallpaper in the master bedroom, the wallpaper Harold and I had chosen for our 20th anniversary. The pattern we'd spent hours selecting, the weekend we'd spent hanging it together, laughing when we got the corners crooked and having to start over. "You can't renovate my house without my permission," I said. Diane's pen stopped moving. When she looked up at me, her mask of helpful concern had completely vanished. "Margaret, I think you're confused about the situation here. Robert is your only heir. This house will belong to us whether you like it or not. We're trying to include you in the planning process, but if you're going to be difficult about every decision, we can certainly proceed without your input." The threat was clear and devastating. They would take over my home with or without my cooperation. The only choice they were offering me was whether I wanted to participate in my own displacement. "Robert agrees with this?" I asked. "Robert wants what's best for everyone. He understands that sometimes hard decisions have to be made for the good of the family." That afternoon, when Robert came by after work, I confronted him directly. "Diane says you're planning to renovate the house." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mom, we're just trying to be proactive. If you decide to stay, you'll benefit from the improvements. If you decide to move, the house will sell for more money. And if I decide I don't want strangers tearing apart the home your father and I created?" Robert sat down heavily on the couch, suddenly looking much older than his 34 years. "Mom, you're not being practical. This house is falling apart. The roof needs work. The windows are old. The kitchen is from the 1980s. You can't afford to maintain it properly on your own. How do you know what I can afford? Dad's life insurance will help, but it won't last forever. And your Social Security isn't enough to cover the mortgage and utilities and everything else." It struck me then that Robert had no idea about Harold's separate assets, the rental income, the investments that Mr. Davidson had shown me. Harold had kept those financial details private, and I hadn't shared the information with anyone yet. "Your father left me more comfortable than you might think," I said carefully. Robert's expression grew concerned. "Mom, sometimes when people are grieving, they're not as realistic about money as they should be. Diane has a degree in business. She's good at this kind of planning." Diane has a degree in business, as if her education somehow trumped my 40 years of managing a household, raising a child, and making financial decisions alongside Harold. "I think I'm capable of understanding my own situation," I said. "Of course you are. But there's no shame in accepting help from family. Diane and I want to make this transition as easy as possible for you." Transition. That's what they were calling it. Not theft, not manipulation, not the systematic dismantling of my independence, just a transition that would be easier if I cooperated. The next few days brought a parade of contractors, real estate agents, and interior designers, all scheduled by Diane without consulting me. They measured my rooms, evaluated my plumbing, and discussed my home's potential like I wasn't there. "This kitchen could be amazing with the right investment," one designer told Diane while I stood in my own doorway. "Knock out this wall, install an island, upgrade all the appliances. It would completely transform the space. Transform it into something unrecognizable, something that bore no resemblance to the kitchen where Harold and I had shared 40 years of meals and conversations and quiet moments over morning coffee." "What do you think, Mrs. Morrison?" the designer asked, suddenly remembering I existed. "I think my kitchen works perfectly fine the way it is." Diane laughed, that tinkling sound that had grown to irritate me like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Margaret is very sentimental about keeping things exactly the same. She hasn't quite adjusted to the idea that change can be positive." The designer nodded sympathetically, as if my attachment to my own home was a character flaw to be managed, rather than a reasonable response to having my life dismantled without my consent. That evening, I called Mr. Davidson. "They're moving very fast," I told him. "Diane is scheduling contractors and acting like the house already belongs to them. Legally, they have no authority to make changes to your property," he said. "But I suspect they're counting on your reluctance to cause family conflict. What can I do?" "Several things. First, you could simply refuse access to contractors. It's your house, and you have every right to control who enters it. Second, you could make it clear that any work done without your written authorization will not be paid for. And third, you could begin exploring your other options more seriously. My other options. The small house across town, the financial independence Harold had quietly provided, the life I could build away from people who saw me as an obstacle to their plans. I need to see that house again," I said. "I think that's a very good idea." The next morning, I told Diane I was going out for the day and wouldn't be available to meet with contractors. "Where are you going?" she asked, as if she had a right to track my movements. "Personal errands," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "Margaret, you're not being very cooperative lately. Robert and I are trying to help you, but you seem determined to make everything more difficult than it needs to be." "I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to maintain some control over my own life. Sometimes we have to give up a little control to gain something better. That's what compromise means. But this wasn't compromise. Compromise involved two parties making mutual concessions to reach an agreement both could live with. What Diane was proposing was my complete surrender disguised as reasonableness. I drove to the small house Harold had left me, this time bringing cleaning supplies and a notebook. The cottage seemed brighter in the morning light, more welcoming than I'd remembered. The kitchen was small but functional, the bedrooms cozy rather than cramped, the living room flooded with sunshine from large windows that faced east. I spent hours walking through the rooms, measuring spaces, imagining how my furniture would fit. Harold's recliner would go perfectly in the corner by the front window. My piano, which Diane had suggested I sell because it took up too much space, would fit beautifully against the living room wall. In the larger bedroom, I could picture Harold's clothes hanging in the closet, the few pieces I wasn't ready to give away. I could keep his books on the shelves, his reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet. Nobody would tell me it was time to let go or suggest that holding on to memories was unhealthy. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt something that might have been excitement about the future. Not the resigned acceptance Diane was pushing me toward, but genuine anticipation for a life that would be entirely my own choice. I made lists of what needed to be done. Cleaning, minor repairs, maybe some fresh paint and colors I actually liked. The work felt manageable, even enjoyable, when it was for myself rather than to increase someone else's property value. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Diane in my living room with a woman I didn't recognize. "Margaret, perfect timing," Diane said. "This is Sandra from Willowbrook Senior Living. I thought you should hear about their current availability." Sandra stood up with the practiced enthusiasm of someone accustomed to selling reluctant customers on major life changes. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm so pleased to meet you. Diane has told me wonderful things about you, and I think you'd be very happy at Willowbrook." I remained standing in my own doorway, car keys still in my hand. "I didn't ask for this meeting." Diane's smile grew strained. "I know you didn't, but you haven't been very proactive about exploring your options. I thought a professional perspective might be helpful." "Ah, we have a lovely 2-bedroom unit that just became available," Sandra continued, pulling out a folder of glossy brochures. "It has a small kitchen, though most residents prefer our dining room for the social aspect, and there's a wonderful activities program." I listened to her practiced pitch about scheduled activities and transportation services and emergency call systems, all the features designed to make independent living unnecessary. The more she talked, the more I understood that places like Willowbrook weren't designed to support independence. They were designed to replace it with managed dependence. "It sounds very nice," I said when Sandra finished, "but I'm not interested." Sandra's smile never wavered. "Oh, I understand the hesitation. Change is always frightening. But most of our residents find that once they adjust, they wonder why they waited so long. The peace of mind alone is worth the transition. Peace of mind, as if my current life was inherently stressful rather than deliberately being made stressful by people who wanted me to give up my autonomy." "Margaret," Diane said, her voice taking on that patient tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "You can't live in denial forever. This house is too much for you, and it's only going to get worse as you get older." "I'm 62, not 92, I said. "But you're alone now. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? What if the furnace breaks down in the middle of winter? What if? The same fears that had kept me awake during Harold's illness, now being weaponized to convince me I was too fragile to manage my own life. "I'll handle those situations if and when they arise," I said. Sandra and Diane exchanged a look that I was beginning to recognize. The look that said I was being stubborn and unrealistic, that they knew what was best for me better than I did. After they left, I sat in Harold's chair and thought about the small house across town, about the life I could build there without anyone's permission or approval, about the financial resources Harold had quietly provided to ensure I'd never have to accept help from people who saw me as a burden. That night, I called Robert. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer," I said. "Of course, Mom. If Diane wasn't in the picture, would you be pushing me to leave this house?" A long pause. "Mom, that's not a fair question. Diane is in the picture. She's my wife, and she's trying to help. But if it was just you and me, like it used to be, would you think I was incapable of living in my own home?" Another pause, longer this time. "I think you're underestimating how difficult it's going to be to maintain this place alone, and I think you're underestimating my ability to make my own decisions about my life. Mom, I just want you to be safe and happy. Then trust me to know what will make me safe and happy." After we hung up, I realized that Robert genuinely believed he was protecting me. He'd been so thoroughly convinced by Diane's arguments that he couldn't see the difference between helping and controlling. But I could see the difference clearly now, and I was done pretending that giving up my independence was the same thing as accepting help. Tomorrow I would start making plans of my own. Plans that didn't require anyone else's approval or understanding. Plans that honored the woman Harold had fallen in love with, the one who was stronger than anyone seemed to remember, including, until recently, myself. I discovered the truth about Diane's intentions quite by accident, while looking for aspirin in my own medicine cabinet. It was Thursday morning, and I had a headache from another sleepless night spent thinking about contractors and renovation plans and senior living facilities. I'd opened the bathroom cabinet when I heard voices coming from the kitchen below. The house's old ventilation system carried sound in unexpected ways, and Diane's voice was rising with excitement. "The estimates came back even better than we hoped," she was saying. "If we do the full renovation, the house should appraise for at least $400,000. Maybe more with the right finishes." I froze with the aspirin bottle in my hand. "That's incredible. Robert's voice replied. I had no idea this place was worth so much. The neighborhood has really improved over the past decade. Your parents just never bothered to keep up with property values. But with the right updates, we could easily clear $300,000 in profit after the renovation costs. $300,000 in profit. They weren't talking about helping me or making my life easier. They were talking about real estate investment returns. What about Mom? Robert asked, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that my son still cared about my welfare. She'll be much happier at Willowbrook, Diane replied. I've already put down a deposit to hold that unit. Once she's settled there, we can move forward with everything. The contractors are ready to start as soon as we get the property cleared. A deposit. She'd put down a deposit on a senior living unit without my knowledge or consent, as if my future was already decided. Are you sure she'll agree to move? Robert sounded uncertain. Diane laughed, that cold sound I'd come to dread. She doesn't really have a choice, does she? She can't afford to maintain this place on her own, and she certainly can't fight us on renovations if we decide to move forward. Sometimes you have to make decisions for people who can't make them for themselves. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the aspirin bottle. They weren't waiting for me to come to my senses or accept their help. They were planning to force me out so they could profit from my home. I feel bad about it, Robert admitted. She's been through so much with Dad's death. And that's exactly why this is the right thing to do, Diane replied, her voice taking on that practiced sympathy she used so well. She's not thinking clearly. Grief makes people irrational, makes them cling to things they should let go of. We're helping her make the transition she needs to make anyway. Irrational. That's how she explained my attachment to the home where I'd spent 40 years of my life. Grief-induced irrationality that needed to be managed by more sensible people. The timing is perfect too, Diane continued. Construction season is just starting so we can get better rates from contractors. And the housing market is hot right now. If we list it next spring, we'll probably get multiple offers. Next spring. They'd already planned the timeline for my displacement. I crept to the top of the stairs, staying out of sight, but straining to hear every word. What if she finds out about the profit margins? Robert asked. Why would she? She doesn't understand real estate markets or construction costs. As far as she knows, we're just trying to help her with necessary repairs. By the time everything is finished, she'll be settled in her new place and grateful that we handled everything for her. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. They plan to lie to me about their motives, manipulate me into giving up my home, and make hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process while telling me it was for my own good. I should probably call her down to discuss the contractor schedules, Robert said. Actually, I think we should start moving forward without her input, Diane replied. She's just going to find reasons to object to everything, and that will slow down the whole process. It's better to present her with a plan that's already in motion. A plan that's already in motion. They weren't seeking my cooperation anymore. They were simply going to steamroll over my objections. I made my way back to the bathroom and closed the door quietly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Everything I'd suspected about Diane's motives was true, and worse than I'd imagined. She wasn't just trying to control my life, she was trying to steal it entirely while convincing me it was for my own benefit. When I came downstairs 20 minutes later, they were both sitting at my kitchen table with papers spread between them, looking like the picture of concerned family members making difficult but necessary decisions. Morning, Mom, Robert said, glancing up with a smile that now looked completely false. We were just going over some of the contractor estimates. The numbers look very reasonable, Diane added. We should be able to get started within the next 2 weeks. I poured myself coffee with hands I hoped weren't visibly shaking. What happens to me during construction? Well, obviously you can't stay here while the work is being done, Diane said. All that dust and noise wouldn't be healthy for someone your age. I think it's the perfect time for you to try out Willowbrook. Consider it a trial run. A trial run that would become permanent once they'd transformed my home into something I could never afford to reclaim. I haven't agreed to any of this, I said. Diane's expression grew impatient. Margaret, we've been discussing this for weeks. You said yourself that the house needs work. I said it might need minor updates. I never agreed to a complete renovation. Sometimes minor updates lead to major discoveries, Diane replied smoothly. Once contractors start opening walls, they often find problems that require more extensive work. It's better to plan for that possibility from the beginning. Robert nodded along like he understood construction, though I knew he'd never so much as replaced a light fixture in his life. What's the total cost going to be? I asked. Diane and Robert exchanged a glance. We're still getting final estimates, Robert said. But don't worry about the cost, Mom. We'll handle all the financial arrangements. They'd handle the financial arrangements by stealing my house and selling it for a profit while convincing me I couldn't afford to live in it. I need some time to think about this, I said. Of course, Diane replied, but her smile was strained. But the contractors need an answer soon. Good crews book up quickly this time of year. After they left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by their contractor estimates and renovation plans, feeling like I was drowning. The scope of work they'd outlined would gut my home completely, stripping away every trace of the life Harold and I had built together. But worse than the physical changes was the emotional manipulation. They'd spent weeks making me feel incapable and dependent, setting up a situation where their theft could be disguised as rescue. I called Mr. Davidson immediately. They're planning to force me out, I told him, my voice shaking with anger and fear. They want to renovate the house and sell it for profit while making me believe I have no other choice. That's not entirely surprising, he said grimly. Harold suspected something like this might happen. That's why he was so careful to provide you with alternatives. Can they legally do this? Can they just take over my house? Not while you're alive and competent, no. But they can make your life difficult enough that you feel like you have no choice but to cooperate. It's a form of elder abuse, Mrs. Morrison. Financial exploitation disguised as family concern. Elder abuse. The words hit me like a slap. I'd heard about such things happening to other people, vulnerable seniors manipulated by greedy relatives. I'd never imagined it could happen to me. What are my options? Several. You could refuse to allow any contractors on your property. You could retain your own attorney to protect your interests. Or you could simply leave before they expect you to. Leave? To your other property. The one they don't know about. You could move there immediately, on your own terms, before they have a chance to manipulate you further. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. I could simply disappear from their plans, remove myself from their manipulation, start over in a place where no one could question my decisions or rearrange my life for my own good. Would that be running away? I asked. Mrs. Morrison, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is remove yourself from a situation where people are trying to harm you. Your husband provided you with the means to be independent. Using those means isn't running away, it's taking control of your own life. That afternoon, I drove to the small house again, this time with a different purpose. Instead of just imagining myself living there, I began planning the actual move. I measured furniture, checked the appliances, made lists of what needed to be done before I could move in permanently. The house felt different now that I was serious about it. Not just a backup plan or a theoretical option, but a real home waiting for me to claim it. A place where I could grieve Harold's loss without anyone telling me how long was appropriate. Where I could keep his belongings until I was ready to let them go. Where I could make decisions about my own life without having to justify them to people who saw me as incompetent. That evening, Diane called to discuss finalizing the renovation timeline. The contractors are eager to get started, she said. I've scheduled them to begin demolition on Monday. We'll need to have you move to Willowbrook by Sunday. Sunday, 3 days away. They weren't asking for my agreement anymore. They were presenting me with an ultimatum disguised as logistics. That seems very rushed, I said. Sometimes it's better to just rip the Band-Aid off, you know? Make the transition quickly instead of dragging it out. Rip the Band-Aid off. As if stealing my home was a minor discomfort to be gotten through efficiently. I'll need to think about it, I said. Margaret, there's nothing left to think about. Everything is arranged. The moving truck will be there Saturday to take your belongings to storage, and I'll pick you up Sunday morning to take you to Willowbrook. A moving truck. To storage. They'd planned every detail of my displacement without consulting me, assuming I'd simply comply once presented with a fait accompli. What if I say no? I asked. A pause, then Diane's voice, colder than I'd ever heard it. Why would you say no, Margaret? Unless you want to live in a construction zone, you really don't have any other choice. After she hung up, I sat in the dark thinking about choices. Diane was right that I didn't have the choice to stay in my current situation, but she was wrong about my other options. I had a choice she didn't know about, resources she couldn't control, and a plan that would free me from their manipulation forever. It was time to use them. I started moving my life on Friday morning, while Diane thought I was having my hair done. The beauty salon appointment had been her idea. Part of what she called getting you ready for your new adventure at Willowbrook. She'd even offered to pay for it, as if a fresh hairstyle would somehow make my forced displacement more palatable. Instead, I drove straight to the small house Harold had left me and began the most important work of my life. I'd hired movers the night before, a small company Mr. Davidson had recommended. They arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. 3 men who worked with quiet efficiency and didn't ask questions about why I was moving furniture out of one house and into another without my family's knowledge. Just the items on the list, Mrs. Morrison? The lead mover asked. consulting the inventory I'd prepared. I nodded, looking at the carefully chosen pieces I was taking with me. Harold's recliner, my piano, our bedroom furniture, the dining room set where we'd shared thousands of meals, the family photos Diane had relegated to storage boxes, my books, my kitchen supplies, the quilts my mother had made. Everything that mattered to me. Everything that held memories worth preserving. I was leaving behind the expensive furniture Harold and I had bought but never really loved, the formal pieces that looked impressive but felt cold. Diane could have those for her renovations. The hardest part was going through Harold's belongings one final time. I selected his favorite shirts, the cardigan he'd worn every evening, his reading glasses, and the coffee mug that still smelled faintly of the dark roast he'd preferred. Small things that wouldn't take up much space, but would keep his presence alive in my new home. By noon, the movers had cleared out everything I wanted to keep. The house looked strange with empty spaces where my life used to be, but not sad. More like a stage set being struck after the final performance. I left a note on the kitchen counter for Diane and Robert. I've decided to make my own arrangements. Thank you for your concern, but I won't be needing your help after all. Margaret, short, polite, and final. Let them figure out what it meant when they arrived with their moving truck and renovation plans. The drive to my new home took 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into a different world. As I pulled into the driveway of the small cottage, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Genuine excitement about the future. The movers had arranged everything exactly as I'd requested. Harold's chair sat in the corner by the front window, positioned to catch the morning sun. My piano filled the living room with familiar presence. Our bed looked perfect in the master bedroom, made up with a quilt my mother had given us for our wedding. Will there be anything else, Mrs. Morrison? The lead mover asked as I signed their paperwork. No, this is perfect. Thank you for being so careful with everything. After they left, I walked through my new home, running my hands over familiar furniture in unfamiliar spaces. Everything fit beautifully, as if the house had been waiting for these particular pieces to make it complete. I made coffee in my own coffee maker, using Harold's favorite mug, and sat in his chair to watch the afternoon light filter through the front windows. For the first time in months, I felt truly peaceful. My phone rang around 3 o'clock. Diane's name appeared on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won out. Margaret, where are you? Her voice was sharp with panic. I went to pick you up at the salon, and they said you never showed up for your appointment. I had other things to take care of, I said calmly. What other things? The moving truck will be there in the morning, and we need to finish packing your personal items tonight. There won't be any packing necessary. I've already moved everything I want to keep. A long silence. Then, what do you mean? You've already moved. I mean, I've taken care of my own relocation, thank you. I won't be needing your moving truck or your assistance with storage. Margaret, this isn't funny. Where are you? I'm home. You're not home. I'm standing in your kitchen right now, and half your furniture is missing. What have you done? I could hear the fury beneath her controlled tone, the rage of someone whose carefully laid plans had been completely disrupted. I've made my own arrangements, I said, as I mentioned in my note. What note? There's no note here. Interesting. Someone had removed my note from the kitchen counter. Probably Robert, trying to buy time to figure out how to handle this unexpected development. I left a note explaining that I won't be needing your help with my living arrangements. This is ridiculous. You can't just disappear without telling anyone where you're going. What if there's an emergency? What if you need help? I'll handle any emergencies that arise, just like I always have. Diane's voice rose to a near shriek. Margaret, you're being completely irrational. You can't live alone in some unknown location. What if you fall? What if you get sick? What if you can't take care of yourself? The same fears she'd been using to manipulate me for weeks, now deployed as weapons to force me back into compliance. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, I said. I've been doing it for 62 years, but you're not thinking clearly. Grief has affected your judgment. You need family support right now, not whatever fantasy of independence you think you can maintain. Fantasy of independence. That's how she characterized my right to make my own decisions about my own life. I appreciate your concern, I said, though I didn't appreciate it at all. But my decisions are final. Fine, but don't expect Robert and me to come running when you realize you've made a mistake. We've invested a lot of time and energy trying to help you, and if you want to throw that away for some stubborn notion of pride, that's your choice. After she hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and thought about the conversation. Diane was angry, but she was also confused. She'd built her entire plan around my perceived helplessness, my supposed inability to function without their guidance. My independence had never been part of her calculations. Robert called an hour later, his voice strained with worry and frustration. Mom, Diane told me you've moved somewhere. This is crazy. You can't just disappear like this. I haven't disappeared, honey. I've simply moved to a place where I can live peacefully. But where? And why didn't you tell us you were planning this? Because you would have tried to talk me out of it. And I didn't want to argue about a decision I'd already made. Of course we would have tried to talk you out of it. We're worried about you. Moving to some random place without any support system, without anyone to check on you. Robert, I'm not an invalid. I don't need anyone to check on me. Everyone needs someone, Mom. Especially when they're dealing with major life changes. You're right. Everyone does need someone. But the someone I needed most was your father, and he's gone. The help you and Diane were offering felt more like control than support. A long pause. Mom, I think you're being unfair. We were trying to help you transition to a more manageable situation. More manageable for whom? Another pause, longer this time. What do you mean? I mean the situation you and Diane planned was very manageable for you. You'd get a renovated house worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I'd get a small room in a facility where I couldn't interfere with your plans. That's not. How did you? I heard your conversation with Diane about the profit margins and the property values, Robert. I know this was never about helping me. It was about positioning yourselves to benefit financially from my displacement. The silence that followed was deafening. I could almost hear Robert's mind racing, trying to find a way to explain or justify what I'd overheard. Mom, you don't understand the whole situation. I understand enough. You and Diane saw an opportunity to improve your financial position by convincing me I was too helpless to maintain my own home. You called it help, but it was really manipulation. That's not true. We genuinely thought Willowbrook would be better for you. While you renovated my house and sold it for a $300,000 profit, another silence. Robert couldn't deny what I'd heard because I'd heard it accurately. Where are you living now? He asked finally, his voice subdued. Somewhere safe and comfortable, where I can make my own decisions about my life. But Mom, you can't afford to maintain a house on your own. Dad's life insurance won't last forever. Poor Robert. He still had no idea about Harold's other assets, the rental income, the investments that made me more financially secure than he realized. Your father left me better provided for than you know, I said gently. I can afford to live independently. But what about emergencies? What if something happens to you and no one knows where you are? I'll make arrangements for emergencies that don't involve giving up my autonomy. Mom, please just tell me where you are. I won't try to change your mind. I just want to know you're safe. I considered his request. Robert sounded genuinely worried, not just frustrated that his plans had been disrupted. Maybe there was hope for rebuilding some kind of relationship with my son, even if it couldn't include his wife. I'm safe, Robert. I'm comfortable, and I'm happy for the first time since your father died. Can that be enough for now? I guess it has to be, he said, though he didn't sound satisfied. Maybe we could have lunch sometime next week, I offered. Just the two of us so we can talk about rebuilding our relationship on a more honest foundation. I'd like that, he said, and for the first time in months, I heard the son I'd raised in his voice. After we hung up, I made myself dinner in my new kitchen, using pans I'd cooked with for decades but in a space that felt fresh and full of possibilities. Through the window, I could see neighbors working in their gardens, children playing in the street, life continuing at a pace that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. I thought about Diane, probably standing in my old house right now, surrounded by contractor estimates and renovation plans that were suddenly pointless. She'd underestimated me completely, assuming I was too weak and too dependent to take control of my own life. But Harold had known better. He'd prepared for this exact situation, giving me the resources and the confidence to choose independence over manipulation, freedom over false security. As evening fell, I settled into Harold's chair with a book I'd been wanting to read for months, but never had time for. Tomorrow, I would start exploring my new neighborhood, maybe visit the library, perhaps find a church where I could make new friends who would know me as Margaret rather than as someone's burden. Tonight, though, I simply enjoyed the profound peace of being exactly where I chose to be, making decisions based on my own needs rather than someone else's agenda. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt truly alive. 3 weeks after my silent escape, Robert knocked on my front door with flowers and humility. I'd been expecting this visit since our phone conversation, but seeing my son standing on my new porch, looking uncertain and a little ashamed, still caught me off guard. He held a bouquet of daisies, my favorite flowers, the kind Harold used to bring me for no special reason except that they made me smile. "Hi, Mom," he said when I opened the door. I was hoping we could have that lunch you mentioned. I stepped aside to let him enter, watching his face as he took in my new home. The living room was bright, with afternoon sunlight streaming through clean windows. My piano sat against one wall, topped with the family photos Diane had wanted to hide away. Harold's chair occupied the corner by the front window, positioned exactly where it had been in our old house, but somehow looking more natural here. "This is really nice," Robert said, and he sounded genuinely surprised. "It's smaller than the old house, but it feels like home," I suggested. "Yeah, like home." I made coffee and sandwiches, and we sat at my small kitchen table, both of us navigating carefully around the conversational landmines that had developed over the past few months. "How did you find this place?" Robert asked, looking around the kitchen appreciatively. "Your father left it to me, along with some other financial provisions I wasn't aware of until after his death." Robert's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Dad left you a house? Why didn't you ever mention it?" "Because until recently, I didn't need it. I was happy in our old home, living with the memories your father and I had created there. But when that became impossible, I discovered I had alternatives." "When it became impossible," Robert repeated slowly. "Because of the renovation plans?" I nodded. "Among other things." Robert set down his coffee and looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "Mom, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." "Do you?" "I let Diane convince me that you couldn't handle living alone. I believed her when she said we needed to make decisions for you because you weren't thinking clearly. I should have trusted your judgment instead of assuming grief had made you incapable." It was a start, though it didn't address the deeper issue of the financial manipulation they'd planned. "What made you change your mind?" I asked. Robert looked uncomfortable. "Honestly? When you disappeared and managed everything on your own, I realized how wrong we'd been about your capabilities. And then when I started looking at the renovation contracts Diane had drawn up." He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. Robert had finally seen the profit margins Diane was planning, the way she'd structured the project to benefit them financially, while convincing me it was for my own good. "She'd lined up buyers for the old house before we'd even started construction," he continued. "The whole thing was designed to flip the property for maximum profit while making you feel like you had no choice but to cooperate. How do you feel about that now?" Robert's face flushed with shame, disgusted with myself for not seeing it sooner, angry at Diane for manipulating both of us, and grateful that you were strong enough to get yourself out of that situation. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both processing the weight of what he'd admitted. "What happens now?" I asked finally. "Well, Diane and I are separated, have been for the past 2 weeks. This was news I hadn't expected, though perhaps I should have. When manipulation fails, manipulators often look for new targets or abandon relationships that no longer serve their purposes." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and surprisingly, I meant it. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted to destroy my son's marriage. "Don't be. I'm starting to understand how much she controlled our relationship, how many of my decisions were really her decisions. The separation is giving me space to figure out who I am without her influence." "And what have you figured out so far?" Robert smiled ruefully. "That I've been a terrible son for the past few years. That I let my wife convince me my own mother was a burden instead of a person deserving respect. That I almost participated in something that would have been elder abuse, even though I was too blind to see it at the time." Elder abuse. The same term Mr. Davidson had used, now coming from my son's lips. At least Robert was beginning to understand the gravity of what they'd almost done. "You weren't terrible," I said gently. "You were manipulated by someone who's very good at manipulation. But you're here now, and you're seeing the situation clearly. That counts for something." "Is there any chance we can rebuild our relationship?" he asked. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'd like to try to be the son you raised me to be." I reached across the table and took his hand. "Robert, you'll always be my son. People make mistakes, especially when they're being manipulated by someone they love and trust. What matters is learning from those mistakes." Relief flooded his face. "Thank you. I was afraid I'd permanently damaged things between us." "It'll take time to rebuild trust," I said honestly. "But I'm willing to work on it if you are." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about safer subjects. Robert told me about his job, his plans for the future now that he was separated, his growing understanding of how isolated he'd become from friends and family during his marriage. I told him about my new neighborhood, the library I'd joined, the church where I'd started attending services. "You seem happier than you've been in months," he observed as we sat on my front porch, watching neighbors tend their gardens. I am happier. For the first time since your father died, I feel like I'm living my own life instead of existing in the margins of someone else's plans. Can I ask you something? Of course. How long have you known about Dad's other financial arrangements? I considered how to answer. I found his letter and the legal documents the night of the funeral, after you and Diane left. He'd prepared for the possibility that I might need to be independent, but he hoped I'd never have to use those resources. He was always thinking ahead like that, Robert said with a sad smile. Remember how he used to practice fire drills with us when I was a kid? Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. He knew you loved me, I said. But he also recognized that love doesn't always protect people from making poor decisions, especially when they're influenced by someone with their own agenda. Robert was quiet for a long moment. He was protecting you from me, wasn't he? From what I might become under the wrong influence. He was protecting me from a situation where I might have to choose between family relationships and personal autonomy. He wanted to make sure I never had to sacrifice my independence just to avoid conflict. And I almost forced you into exactly that choice. But you didn't. When it mattered, when I needed to leave, you let me go. That's something. As evening approached and Robert prepared to leave, he paused at the front door. Mom, can I ask you one more thing? Sure. Are you lonely here? Living alone, I mean? I thought about the question seriously. Was I lonely? I missed Harold every day, would probably miss him for the rest of my life. But was I lonely in the way Robert meant? Isolated and disconnected from meaningful relationships. I'm alone, I said finally. But I'm not lonely. There's a difference. I have neighbors who wave when I work in the garden. I have librarians who recommend books they think I'll enjoy. I have a church community where people know my name and ask after my health because they care, not because they're monitoring my capability. And you have a son who's learning to be better, Robert added hopefully. Yes, I have that too. After he left, I sat on my front porch as darkness fell, thinking about the conversation. 3 weeks ago, I'd been facing the loss of my home, my independence, and my dignity. Tonight, I was sitting on my own porch, in my own house, planning my own future. The irony wasn't lost on me. Diane's attempt to force me into dependency had actually led me to discover resources I didn't know I had. Her manipulation had pushed me toward a freedom I might never have claimed otherwise. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. An unknown number. Mrs. Morrison, this is Sandra from Willowbrook Senior Living. I'm calling about the deposit that was placed to hold a unit for you. Since you haven't moved in as scheduled, we need to discuss the arrangements. Diane's deposit. I'd forgotten about that detail. I won't be needing the unit, I said. You can refund the deposit to whoever paid it. Oh, I see. May I ask if you've found alternative arrangements? Yes, I have. Thank you for calling. After I hung up, I realized that this phone call represented the final loose thread from Diane's plans. She'd probably been hoping I'd eventually show up at Willowbrook, confused and defeated, ready to accept whatever arrangements she'd made. Instead, she'd lost her deposit and gained nothing but the knowledge that her manipulation had failed completely. I thought about her sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything from the experience, or if she'd simply moved on to her next target. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all. She belonged to a chapter of my life that was closed now. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities I was free to explore at my own pace. I could travel if I wanted to, using the rental income from Harold's properties. I could redecorate this house to reflect my own tastes, instead of compromising with someone else's preferences. I could make friends who saw me as Margaret, not as someone's aging mother or a problematic relative. Most importantly, I could honor Harold's memory by living the kind of independent, purposeful life he'd always encouraged me to pursue. He'd given me the tools for freedom. I'd found the courage to use them. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked around my small house and felt nothing but gratitude. Not just for the physical space, but for the journey that had brought me here. The manipulation and betrayal that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the catalyst for my liberation. I was home now, in every sense of the word, and for the first time since Harold's death, I was excited to see what tomorrow would bring. After the last mourner left, I had stayed quiet about the second house across town. When my daughter-in-law said that one day without me there would be the best day of her life, I smiled. She was right about one thing, they'd never see it coming. But she was wrong about everything else. The best days of my life weren't behind me, they were just beginning.